Hello, welcome back to my channel and to the first part of a retrospective on Pier Paolo Pasolini, the great Italian film director and for me one of the most important Italian artists full stop in the 20th century. This retrospective was spurred by me receiving this for my birthday. It's the Criterion box set of his first 9 films, jointly bought for me by my brother and my sister, for which I'm very grateful. And I'm slowly making my way through it, and I'm going to watch all of Pasolini's films. Now, I'm going to start this retrospective by trying to do something a bit different, okay? If you don't want to watch this introduction, I will put the timestamp below where I actually start discussing the films. But I just wanted to start with a question. The question is this: is it possible to really love and feel an affinity for a director's work where the director has a very different politics to your own? You know, we live in an era where, students walk around with logos on their t-shirts saying, "No one can love a Tory." If you read criticism, if you read academic work on film, any sense that there is a right-wing or left critical position in a film or a book or a work of art means that somehow the work of art becomes suspect or should be sidelined. It's as though there's a kind of fear of ideological or political infection, right? Something that is not of the order, it's kind of got into your bloodstream and it must be expunged. The idea growing that if something is not left or liberal, it's wrong. And therefore that means is that if the person is demonstrably of different politics or different ideology to our own, we cannot love it, we must reject it. Is that true? Another question: is it possible to really love or feel an affinity for someone who has a different spiritual or religious idea of the world to yourself? Only last night I was watching a new film, a Vietnamese film called Inside the Yellow Cocoon Shell, which is clearly made by a Catholic filmmaker. And the film is full of Catholic imagery, and it's about someone trying to find faith and going through the various stages of finding faith in the Christian tradition, with Christian symbolism. Is anyone who isn't Christian or doesn't understand the Catholic faith immediately at a remove at arm's length from that film? Is it possible for a straight man like myself to really appreciate or feel an affinity for someone of a work of a different sex, i.e. a woman, or a different sexuality, i.e. a gay man? One of the things that's happened in the last 20, 30 years has been the rise of identity politics, the politics of representation. And the curious thing about this politics is it's trying to bring marginalised voices from marginalised communities into mainstream discussion. But in doing so, it's segmented people off. Think about this. Pasolini, a noted gay filmmaker, who was openly gay at a time when it was very dangerous to be openly gay in Italy, was at the time not seen as a gay filmmaker, but as a filmmaker, and his homosexuality was part of his films. Now he's a gay filmmaker. So, in fact, this bringing in, this identity politics, supposedly bringing everyone together, has actually split people up and divided them. Now, I'm told that as a straight person, I can't really have an affinity with a gay filmmaker. But at the same time, if I don't watch gay films and I only watch straight films, then I'm being politically incorrect. Is it possible, then, for me as a straight man to really respond and understand and feel and empathise with the work of a gay filmmaker? Those are the kind of questions I want to ask at the start of this video. So let's go back to politics. Now, of course, what we have to remember here is this. If we went back to the late 60s, 1970-71, and we asked Paolo Pasolini this question, he would of course dismiss it as absolutely stupid. Of course it's possible to like a writer or a filmmaker who's got a different politics to your own. Of course it's possible to like someone who's conservative, right? That shows how far our society has changed. I think any artist at that time would have dismissed such a question as juvenile, which frankly it is. But now, in universities, in education establishments, in the media, it is a current question. Now, why would Pasolini have discussed it as stupid? Because essentially, up until that point, although Pasolini was a very political animal and artists were politicised, art itself had not become so politicised. It was much more of a general area in which different voices from different politics and different spiritualities convened and talked to each other. So it was possible, for example, someone like Italo Calvino, who was a leftist, to write a thesis and deeply admire Conrad, who he saw as a reactionary conservative. I've used this analogy before, that in 1969, two writers on the television programme Doctor Who, one of whom was a sort of cuddly Tory, and one of whom was a British communist who was actually under surveillance by British intelligence, wrote a story together, 10 episodes, 10 half-hour episodes together, as best friends. That's how far we've come. We've come from a world where that was possible, and no one would even question it. You know, you could have leftist people who admire the writing of Evelyn Waugh, for example, right? We've come from that to where we are now, where we're much more polarised and segmented from each other. I think it's a ludicrous question, because art is not politics, and politics is not art. Many leftist pundits, I think, have been guilty of trying to conflate the two, and I think they're wrong. Why do I think they're wrong? A, because politics, I don't think fundamentally is a business about being nice. It's about decisions. It's about people sitting in rooms making decisions for thousands of people, and that's got nothing to do with art. I get a bit queasy about pundits and writers who've never had to make a political decision in their life, saying that watching a film is a political act, in a very small, lowercase p sense. But politics really is making decisions that actually have an active impact on someone's life. To say that art is politics is to cheapen politics. It's to cheapen that incredibly complex decision-making process and series of compromises. Art never has to compromise. It never has to make a decision or do something that will directly affect someone's life. But similarly, to say politics is art is to cheapen art. Art is the one endeavour in our lives where we can collectively express ourselves and express those deeper strains in society, which we can't express in the everyday, about love, about our hopes, about the nature of our civilization, about the entire nature of our society and its construction. Once you bring in politics, you start to close that down. You start to close down the way that art brings us together in a collective to talk about ourselves. So you actually demean it. That's why I think it's more than possible for someone like me. I think we should be honest here, so I hope I don't lose any subscribers here, but I'm broadly a centre-right person. There you are, there's your confession for the evening. Pasolini was a Marxist. Interestingly, I read actually that in his young life he flirted with fascism, as many people did in Italy in the 30s and early 40s, but then he moved quite the opposite way and became a lifelong Marxist. Is it possible for me to really appreciate the films of a Marxist? Of course it is. Because the underlying desire of Pasolini is to express those things that he and I and all human beings have in common. All human beings want the same things. They want peace, they want stability, they want to have family, they want to have hope. You know, the way that they achieve those things, that's where politics comes in. They might bitterly disagree, right? Some people might want a tougher society, a more rawer society. Some people might want a kinder society, whatever. The fact is that they want the same things, and that's what art's expressing. And that's why it's perfectly feasible to me for a conservative to admire, in fact, be moved and deeply affected and challenged by the work of a leftist, and by a leftist can be deeply moved and challenged by the work of a conservative. Now let's talk about spirituality. I, by nature, am a rationalist, I'm a secularist, I don't much care for organised religion, I've never been part of an organised religion, don't want to be. But I have an interest in faith, and I recognise that in me I want to believe in something. And what that something is what we all want to believe in. We all want to know why we're here. What is the point of humanity? What is it to be a human being? That's a spiritual yearning. It's a spiritual questioning. So it doesn't matter if you're religious or not. That spiritual idea of trying to look across, not just as the individual, but across as part of humanity, that links you to films of faith. You might not share the actual faith of the person making the movie, but you're asking the same questions. So it's perfectly possible to, all his life, Pasolini and the Vatican Church were bitter enemies. They hated each other. But I think that Pasolini was a Catholic. He just didn't like the church. He didn't like the organisation of religion. But I think he did believe. It's said that he didn't, but I think he did. I think it's very evident in his films, right? I think it's possible for me to understand Pasolini, even though we're coming from different spiritual traditions. Now we come to the third one, more about identity politics, about Pasolini's homosexuality. Now, you see, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this retrospective. I admire Pasolini so much. In fact, I admire the man even more than the director. My God, this guy was incredible, right? So he started off as a poet, and then he got into filmmaking. And right from the beginning, he's criticising the Italian state and its culture. He's from a Marxist perspective, he's criticising the church, and he's openly gay. I mean, how did he get away with it? And yet he became this amazingly important figure in Italian society and was deeply admired. He was constantly in trouble with the police, constantly in trouble with the church, and of course eventually he was murdered by a roadside in very, very dubious circumstances. What an incredible person. But let's go back to the fact his homosexuality. His homosexuality is present, not absolutely openly directly until the later films, when things had eased, after 1968. But it's present right from the very beginning. And it's present from the way he shoots people. Now, I'll tell you a little anecdote, just for a bit of fun, right? Many years ago, Mulholland Drive by David Lynch came out, right? And I went to see it. Bowled over by it. Thought it was absolutely brilliant. And there's these two beautiful women, and there's a lot of undressing of women in that film, and I'm thinking, this film's beautiful. It's about desire, it's about eroticism, it's fantastic, I'm really enjoying it. The next night, I went to see a repertory showing of a film called Malpertuis. It was directed by a gay Belgian director called Harry Kummel. And the film starts, and a guy in a sailor suit, classic gay fantasy stereotype, he sort of minces, I'm going to use that word to get the point across, up a gangplank, and then he stands there, sort of iconically, like that. And I'm there thinking, oh God, here we go. And then I caught myself, and I thought, hang on a second, you were enjoying watching those women last night in Mulholland Drive, but now when you see a male sexual object, you're like looking at your watch. Right. So there's the question. The identity politics person would jump on me and say, well, there you are then, you see. You are prejudiced. You can't see, men as gay men see them or as women see them. You are at one remove from the film. But I don't feel that with Pasolini. And what's interesting about Pasolini is his choice of men. We're going into murky waters here, aren't we? But you see, most of the time, mainstream gay films choose pretty boys. So you think of Jude Law playing Bosie in Wild, right? Pasolini very consciously chose, how should we say this, men from the rougher side of life. There's a very amusing story about this. I'll just tell you this quickly. Tom Baker, who played Doctor Who, appeared in the Canterbury Tales later on, and he told this hilarious story of how Pier Paolo would go down to the docks and he'd go and bring these boys back. Most of the people that Pasolini worked with were amateur actors. They were people he found on the streets, rather like his great hero Caravaggio the painter, who often found street people portraying these kind of characters from the Bible, which caused a great scandal, both in Caravaggio's time and in Pasolini's time. And Tom Baker told this story about how Pasolini would come back from the docks with these guys, and there was one particular boy that Tom Baker saw, and he said he was so ugly and had paint-stripping halitosis. and we couldn't understand why Paolo liked him. And then he took his clothes off, and then we understood why Paolo liked him, you know. But the point is that Paolo Pasolini picks rough guys, right? Not pretty boys, not effeminate boys, right? And they are beautiful. And I can see that they're beautiful, right? They have fascinating faces, you're drawn to them, and you can see why he finds them exciting and beautiful and sexual and sensual. With Harry Kummel's film, I couldn't see that, I didn't feel it. But with Pasolini, I felt it. Now, what's the difference? The difference is the erotic. Pasolini is not often discussed in this sense, but he's an eroticist. Now, what I mean by that is, he's a director who makes everything has an erotic, sensual feel. The landscapes, the people, the faces, both men and women, everyone has a beauty. It's a natural beauty, a beauty that comes from inside, and he can capture it. Together with his photographer, Tonino Dellicoli, he can capture it. Everything is beautiful, everything is sensual, everything has the possibility of sex and sensuality. So you feel the beauty of these men, even if you're not a gay man, right? And that is one of the great strengths of Pasolini cinema, and that's why I think a straight man can empathise and find common ground in a gay man's films, and vice versa. And putting desire and physical attraction aside, all of us feel love and need and affection. These are universal values that we can all plug into. So it doesn't really matter who the two protagonists of the love story are. We can understand their emotions. Again, I worry that identity politics is actually separating us into little groups when art is trying to provide an overall sentiment of feeling that we can all plug into. So that's by way of an introduction to Pasolini's work. I just wanted to do that because Pasolini is such an interesting figure in himself. You know, a Marxist, I think, quasi-Catholic, gay man, making films in a time of great conservatism in Italy, getting away with it, and changing cinema into the bargain. What a guy. Okay, let's get into the films. Now, Accattone and Mamma Roma is an extraordinary one-two. I think Accattone, to this day, remains one of the greatest feature debuts in film history. And he was learning about filmmaking on the go. You know, most of the discussion around the film, the interviews around it and testimonies around the film, show that actually Pasolini was learning on the job, and he learned really quickly. This is a filmmaker who, right from the get-go, seems to know what he wants and where he's going. And right from the get-go, what I mean is this. The opening credits. The opening credits are presented like the title face of a book, right? And we have the music of Bach playing over them. And we open with a quote from Dante, right? It's like something like, "The devil shouts to God, you took him from me just for for one tear." So straight away, Pasolini, his films are they're sort of linking themselves to great art, and this is an important thing about Pasolini. I don't think this is pretentious. I think it's the way he sees. You see, the thing about Pasolini is, Bertolucci, who was working with him as an assistant, said that Pasolini started cinema all over again, as the great directors often do. When you're watching the great directors, you feel that they're rebuilding cinema from scratch. And he was. But I think there's often a mistake made by critics and pundits about 60s cinema. They want to see it as all new and all fresh, a break, a rupture with the past. This is not true, certainly in Italian cinema. All of the great Italian directors, whether it's Rossellini, Antonioni, Fellini, whatever they're doing that's original and new, it's part of a continuity with the past. And Pasolini was very conscious of that, and he wanted it. You know, it's often said that modernism and postmodernism sort of stopped, and radically, modernized art. No, they were a continuation. They were born from that continuity of art. And that's what Pasolini is showing right at the beginning of this film. He's self-consciously making the film literary. He's self-consciously taking it back to the works of Dante. And, you know, in his cinematography with Tonino Delle Colli, he will recall, you know, great paintings by Caravaggio. He'll recall Mantegna in Mamma Roma, of course. The boy at the end, you remember, is sort of tied on that thing. And, you know, Pasolini keeps returning to it, and it's Mantegna's Christ. He will pick men in his films that recall the people that you see in Caravaggio, etc. It's a very conscious, so it's a new cinema that consciously builds on the past. All the way through these films, in both Accattone and Mamma Roma, he keeps going back to the old Roman fortifications, the rubble, the ruins of them still standing. And in the background, surrounding them, are the new outskirts of Rome, all these built new housing estates. That's almost a metaphor for Pasolini's cinema. The world of the new being examined, but the world of the old is still there. We're still building from that. Now, Pasolini is starting out from neorealism, right? These are stories of ordinary, poor people living in Rome, and it's shot with very little sort of surrealism or Baroque imagery, right? But it's neorealism in a new case. So we have this self-conscious continuity of art, as we've talked about. And also, Pasolini is taking it in a new direction. Christianity is supposedly the religion of the meek. Well, Pasolini takes us right down to the depths. Because the title character of his first film, Accattone, is probably the worst kind of human being. He's a pimp. What better way to scandalise and provoke the Italian conservative landscape than to concentrate on a pimp, and a pimp who is going to be sort of, as the Dante quote suggests, he's going to be saved, right? And so this pimp is played by Franco Citti. Franco Citti was one of these actors that Pasolini picked up in the city. He was a labourer and a painter, and he went on to appear in 6 other Pasolini films. He became a major Italian actor. Extraordinary face. And he's got this woman who he pimps out as a prostitute, and he leads this pretty awful life, going from one woman to the next, a pretty dreadful human being, and he eventually gets killed in a motor accident. Out of this, Pasolini builds this complex bric-a-brac of looking at the lowest depths of Rome, but also raising these lower depths to a higher poetry. You know, Terence Davis once spoke about the poetry that ordinary working people deserve, and that's what he tried to do in his films, and that's what Pasolini is doing here. There's also a kind of third, hidden level of the film, and that's in the portrait of the pimps themselves, who all gather together. They're this sort of marginalised group in society, all men, who socialise together, drink together, and are often seen together chatting and laughing. And this is clearly a kind of coded portrait of gay men in Roman society. It can't say that, but it can sort of show that sort of camaraderie between men. There's a wonderful shot of them laughing, and in the final scenes of them sitting on a roadside just laughing at a joke together. And you can see that in a coded way. I think that Pasolini is trying to show the gay life, that gay men getting together and enjoying each other's company, completely marginalised and despised by society. The film is full of biblical imagery, and sometimes Pasolini plays very provocatively with the iconography of the pimp, so that at one point he's trying to get this woman to prostitute herself for him, and in the background is a large Christ painted on the side of a church. Is he a saviour or is he the devil? The film is trying to show in a way that poverty means that we're only ever one step away from being either. That's the rather sort of provocative message of the film in some ways. There's also, of course, the cheeky implication there that Accattone's pimp might offer more salvation than the church does. And that's actually mirrored in a scene in Mamma Roma, where Mamma Roma, played by Anna Magnani, goes to see a priest for help to get her son a job. And the priest fobs her off with all sorts of ridiculous excuses, and you see the light in her eyes fades, and she realises the truth of things, that the church is not going to save her. Similarly, the women in Accattone's life take on the aspect of different women from biblical texts. So, for example, Stella, the woman he meets at the bottle farm, becomes his kind of Beatrice, becomes this kind of pure woman who he starts to admire. But also the women who work for him are also his Mary Magdalenas, of course. Pasolini also is really clever. I always think this is one of the things that shows off a good director from a bad director, is their use of symbols and the little details in a film that you might not spot. So, for example, what happens during the film? Accattone comes looking for his old wife, who's deserted him. I don't blame her. And she's working at this kind of bottle recycling place. So they take old bottles, wash them out, and then, bring them back. So you get these imagery of all these bottles, massive piles of bottles, and this is how these people are trying to sustain a living. About 15 minutes later, you see Accattone's son, this little 5-year-old boy. He's got bottles lined up in a yard, and he's throwing stones at them. And that's a brilliant little detail, that this object, a bottle, which is it's the thing that stops these people from dying, from not being able to eat. It's their wealth. But it's so, in itself, it's such an insignificant object. It's such a worthless object that it's also this, can be used for a kid playing a game. And whether it gets smashed or not doesn't really matter. And that speaks volumes about the life these people are living. That little detail tells you so much, where other films, spend hours and hours trying to make the same point. And that's the brilliance of Pasolini. So this is a cruel film. When I did the Claude Chabrol retrospective and I watched his early 60s films, I was struck by how cold his films were and what a cold portrait of the world they had. And actually this is true of a lot of 60s films. A lot of 60s directors saw the modern world as a terribly cold, cruel place. You see this in Pasolini, you see it in Chabrol, you see it in the later films of Bresson, an amazingly cold world. Also, incidentally, talking about 60s films, there are dream sequences in these two films that are very redolent of Bergman, interestingly enough. But also, Pasolini shows this world, the world of poverty, is one where people are constantly talking about hunger, suicide, or engaging in children's games as though poverty has forced them into being children. All of this is the chaotic world of Accattone. It's an extraordinary debut film. In his second film, Mamma Roma, he streamlines it. It's much more novelistic, it's much more pared down and controlled. In some ways, I'm sad about that, because I quite like the raggedy rawniness of Accattone. I think it's quite extraordinary. But at the centre of Mamma Roma is an extraordinary performance. It's the first time he works with a proper professional actor, and that actor is Anna Magnani, one of the great actors of all time. I love Anna Magnani, and she is magnificent here. Absolutely magnificent. This is the first of Pasolini's Life of Christ films. He will, of course, make his next film as The Gospel According to St. Matthew, which we'll talk about in the next video. That's a much more standard Life of Christ film. But this is also a Life of Christ film. And in it, Anna Magnani plays the Virgin Mary. Although she's not a virgin, she is a prostitute. And her son becomes Christ. Her son, she's been in prison, she comes out of prison, she rescues her son from a sort of life out in the boondocks, in the provinces, takes him back to Rome and tries to turn him into a good young man. But he goes to the bad. And eventually he gets taken to prison, and he dies in prison, crucified, tied to a table. So it's a kind of Life of Christ film, and it couldn't be more provocative to the church, that the Virgin Mary becomes a prostitute, Christ becomes a little delinquent, and the end of the film sees Mamma Roma and the people she lives with in her community looking across to the dome of a church in the middle of their housing estate, a defiant look at God and the church. So it's real sort of fist up to, the church military state sort of thing. What I find fascinating about this film is, Magnani's performance is incredible. And there are two sequences of Magnani in this film which I think are quite extraordinary, and where Pasolini's filmmaking reaches a new level of confidence. They're both set at night, and they're in the red light district, and Mamma Roma is standing with the prostitutes, and she decides to go home, and she starts walking home and the camera starts pulling back. And as she pulls back, various clients, men, come to talk to her, and she continues her story. They peel off and another one comes, but she continues her story. So it's very realistic, but it's also very staged. It's deliberately sort of artificial, and it's an extraordinary sequence. I think this is where Pasolini starts to really understand what he can do with cinema and how he can make it his own. And these two sequences are very clever thematically as well, because in both of them, Magnani delivers this monologue about the father of her child, but in each case the monologue seems to be different. So there is a question mark about the father. The father seems to be this enigmatic, mysterious, almost non-existent character, okay, indicating the virgin birth, right? So in this sequence, Pasolini is playing with that very provocative imagery and iconography. The two films go together. Accattone is a bit more wild, a bit more chaotic, but I think it's sort of a richer experience. But Mama Roma, though it's more streamlined, more of a traditionally great film, Magnani's performance is so fantastic. And the young guy who plays her son matches her. He's got an extraordinary face, although apparently he was overdubbed by another actor because he couldn't remember his lines. But, that's Pasolini for you. He picks people for their character and their, sensual presence rather than for their acting quality. So I think they're both incredible films. They're both the advent of a major talent in world cinema. Going back and watching them again was wonderful. The use of music, the photography, the extraordinary mix of old and new, the extraordinary mix of the raw with the sensual. No other director at that time was quite getting close to that, in my opinion. Thanks very much.